Welcome, deep divers, to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question that has, well, really shaped how we think about global politics for centuries, and it still sparks some pretty fierce debate.
Hmm.
What if the widely accepted idea, that democracies don't fight each other, what if it isn't quite as simple as it seems?
Right.
What if the very definition of democracy that we use in this context is actually hiding some fascinating, maybe even challenging complexities, assumptions we've held for decades might need another look?
Absolutely. We're diving deep into the democratic peace theory. It's this powerful, almost comforting idea, isn't it?
It really is.
That democracies are just inherently more peaceful, especially with each other. It's shaped foreign policy, academic discussions.
For a very long time. So we'll start by tracing its origins, going back to Enlightenment philosophy. Then we'll meticulously dissect the proposed mechanisms. How is this piece supposed to work?
But then, and this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit uncomfortable, we're going to uncover the robust critiques, the alternative explanations that contemporary research throws up, shaking up some of those comfortable assumptions.
And our sources for this, just so you know, are a stack of pretty rigorous academic papers. These aren't just opinion pieces.
No, these are detailed studies. They test, they critique, they provide evidence both for and against these theories, sometimes very strong counterarguments.
That's right. And our mission for you, the listener, is to equip you with a truly nuanced understanding. Why do states go to war? Or, maybe more importantly, why do they sometimes choose peace?
And how much does the internal makeup of a state, its political system, how much does that really play a role? Or maybe how much does it not play a role?
Exactly. We hope this deep dive sparks some aha moments for you. It definitely did for us digging into this material. It might just reshape how you view the forces of war and peace.
Yeah, are we just seeing a correlation here? Democracies and peace happening together? Or is there a deep causal link? And if so, what kind of link is it?
Those are the big questions we're digging into today. So let's begin by tracing the intellectual lineage of this powerful idea, the enduring promise of democratic peace. Assent, the enduring promise of democratic peace. Kant's vision and its core logics. Okay, to really get our heads around democratic peace theory, we have to go back, way back to 1795, and a philosopher who was anything but naive, Immanuel Kant.
Right, Kant, Perpetual Peace, a seminal work.
Exactly. His essay laid out this vision that's just resonated for centuries, influencing countless scholars, policymakers. But the key thing is, Kant wasn't some starry-eyed dreamer thinking peace is just about goodwill.
Not at all. He was quite the realist in many ways. He understood the international system was anarchic, inherently prone to conflict.
He warned that without fundamental changes, peace would always just be temporary, right? Like just a pause between wars.
Just truces.
Well,
But crucially, he also offered a path, a kind of natural process, he thought, driven by human self-interest that could lead to a more lasting, stable peace.
so what was this path? What did he identify?
Well, Kant laid out three key definitive articles for achieving this perpetual peace. And these have really become the bedrock for a lot of the later democratic peace theory. He saw them as practical conditions, not just ideals.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, he stressed the importance of republican constitutions. Now, for Kant, this meant a form of shared governance. Citizens, not just one autocratic ruler, have to give their consent to go to war.
Okay, so the people have a say.
Exactly. And his crucial point was, citizens are the ones who actually bear the burdens of war.
Right, the lives lost, the resources spent, the economy disrupted, all of that.
All of it. Therefore, they'd be far more hesitant, naturally cautious about plunging their nation into conflict compared to, say, a monarch who doesn't really bear those personal costs.
Makes intuitive sense, so that caution would make these Republican states more peaceful?
That was his argument. Inherently more pacific. That's the first pillar. Second, he talked about a commercial spirit.
Trade, basically.
Yeah, essentially the expansion of international trade and economic interdependence between nations. As states get more tangled up economically.
The costs of war just skyrocket, right? Disrupting trade, damaging economies.
Precisely. Severing those profitable connections becomes prohibitively expensive. So this economic self-interest, the simple desire for prosperity, creates powerful incentives to keep things peaceful.
War becomes bad for business.
Very bad for business. And the third article, Kant envisioned a federation of interdependent republics.
Okay, so not a world government. He wasn't pushing for that.
No, he actually warned against a single world state, thought it could become a soulless despotism. Instead, he imagined more like a collective security arrangement, maybe a confederation.
Where states keep their sovereignty?
Yes, member states remain sovereign, but they're bound by a commitment to peaceful dispute resolution, to international law. This federation would kind of institutionalize peace.
Provide a forum for talking things out, a collective deterrent, maybe.
Exactly. Making violence among the members increasingly unthinkable, illegitimate even.
So if I'm following, Kant thought that people's basic desire for freedom, for prosperity, would naturally push things in this direction.
That was his belief. People demand Republican governments for a say in their fate, they seek trade to improve their lives, and eventually they realize the benefits of collective security to protect those gains.
So these forces working together lead to international law, organizations, and a system where war among these states just becomes less and less likely.
That's the core vision, a powerful and, undeniably optimistic framework, but one he thought was grounded in rational self-interest. B, the two pillars of democratic peace theory, norms and institutions.
Okay, that's the Kantian foundation. Powerful stuff. But how do modern scholars take that vision and turn it into specific mechanisms? How exactly is democracy supposed to promote peace today?
Right, this is where it often gets boiled down, perhaps simplified, into two main theoretical pathways, the normative logic and the structural or institutional logic.
Norms and institutions. Okay, let's unpack those. How are they supposed to work?
Let's start with one, the normative logic, sharing values and respect. The basic idea here is that democracies, well, ideally, they take how they sort things out at home, debate, compromise, respecting rights, and they project that approach onto how they deal with other democracies.
So they export their domestic norms.
That's the theory. They externalize internal norms of compromise, peaceful conflict resolution, respect for individual rights into their foreign policy. So they treat other democracies with that same kind of mutual respect.
Because they see them as similar, sharing the same values.
Exactly. The mechanism is rooted in perception and shared identity. They think it's maybe unjust or just unwise to fight other democracies because they see them as having similar values, similar systems. It's like a club.
A club with rules for how members treat each other.
Kind of. And a really key assumption here is that democracies recognize each other as democracies. And importantly, they trust each other to uphold these shared norms.
That recognition and trust is crucial then.
Absolutely. It's thought to foster peaceful interactions, make conflict less likely between them.
Okay, so it's like this shared identity, this we're the same kind of country feeling that builds trust and makes fighting seem wrong. But what if that trust isn't there? Or what if the values aren't really shared or aren't perceived as shared?
That's exactly where the challenges start to come in, and we'll definitely get into those. But let's lay out the second pillar first. 2, the structural institutional logic. Checks, balances, and public will.
Okay, so this is less about values and more about how democracies are actually set up?
Precisely. The core idea is that the institutional features within democracies make them less prone to war, not just because of values, but because of their structure. There are a few mechanisms here.
Like what?
Well, mechanism 1 is accountability and public constraint. Democratic leaders are ultimately accountable to the people who elect them.
Right, the voters.
And the general assumption is that the public opposes costly wars, especially against other democracies, because they're the ones paying the price in lives, in treasure.
So leaders have a disincentive to start unpopular wars.
A strong disincentive, theoretically. Kant himself mentioned this, right? Citizens considering the calamities of war before committing.
Okay, accountability. What else?
Mechanism 2, openness and transparency. Democratic processes, free speech, public debates, elections are thought to make a state's intentions clearer.
Harder to hide war plans.
Supposedly. Harder to mislead your own people or other states. This transparency is meant to reduce misperception, make it easier for others to gauge your real intentions or resolve, and maybe avoid conflicts based on guesswork.
Makes sense. And the third mechanism?
Slow mobilization. The idea that needing public support, needing legislative approval, those checks and balances built into democratic systems.
Like needing Congress to declare war, for example.
Exactly. That slows down the decision to use force. It prevents those hasty, impulsive actions that can quickly escalate. Gives time for diplomacy, for cooler heads to prevail.
So if the normative logic is about shared values making war unthinkable between democracies, the institutional logic is about shared processes making war harder, or at least slower, to actually start.
You've got it. That's the theoretical framework in a nutshell. Makes a lot of sense on paper, doesn't it?
Yeah.
See, defining democracy for the theory. more than just elections.
It does make theoretical sense. But when we're talking about democracy here, in these studies, it's not just about holding elections, is it? I get the sense the definition is quite specific.
That's a really critical point. And yeah, you're right. It's essential for understanding the nuances. In most of this research, democracy usually means specifically liberal democracy.
Liberal democracy. Okay, what does that entail?
It's a multifaceted definition.
Right.
It goes way beyond just having elections or majority rule. It includes, first, political freedom.
Like civil liberties, rights?
Exactly. A robust system of civil liberties, political rights, freedom of speech, assembly, free press. People can participate freely without fear.
Okay, what else?
Second, economic freedom. Generally, the institution of a market economy, private property rights. That's seen as part of the package.
Right, providing a basis for individual prosperity and choice.
And third, maybe most importantly, liberal ideology. These are states where liberal ideas are dominant. Free discussion, regular competitive elections that happen in practice, not just on paper.
How do you measure that?
Well, indicators include things like equality before the law, or seeing appeals to personal freedom, self-preservation, prosperity being dominant in public debate, rather than, say, appeals to national glory or conquest.
So it's really a whole ethos, isn't it? Not just a political system. Rights, markets, a certain way of thinking about liberty and public discussion.
Absolutely. And this leads to a crucial distinction our sources highlight, the difference between just democratic states and liberal democracies.
Okay, like ancient Greece, they had democracy, sort of.
Exactly. Ancient Greek democracies, while pioneering popular rule, were often, as one source puts it, restive, adventurous, conquering. Athens valued heroism, conquest. It wasn't about universal harmony or individual liberty in the modern sense, and it relied on slavery.
So popular rule doesn't automatically mean peaceful foreign policy.
Not at all. Which is why that historical nuance matters. Just having votes doesn't guarantee pacific behavior.
Any more modern examples of this distinction?
Well, a stark one is the Confederate States of America during the U.S. Civil War. You could argue it had some democratic features, elections, representative bodies, but because of slavery, the fundamental denial of rights to a huge part of its population, it was profoundly illiberal.
Yeah, didn't share those core liberal values.
Not even close. So it becomes this important exception or clarification in democratic peace discussions. It lacked that liberal character that's supposed to underpin the peace. So yeah, the definition really, really matters here. The devil's in those details. 2, the democratic peace in action. Historical cases and the role of perception.
Okay, that distinction between democracy and liberal democracy is vital. And it brings us to something you touched on earlier, this fascinating, maybe slippery aspect of the normative logic, the role of perception. For the democratic peace to work, states have to see each other as fellow democracies, right? They have to perceive those shared liberal values. But is that perception reliable? Is it always clear, consistent, accurate even?
This is such a critical point, and one that, frankly, a lot of the early democratic peace research kind of assumed away or just didn't dig into enough.
They just assumed everyone knows who's a democracy.
Pretty much. A lot of theories implicitly assume states have common knowledge about each other's regime type, that it's objective, stable.
But reality is messier.
Much messier. Research really suggests this assumption often doesn't hold. Think about it. Policymakers have their own beliefs, party affiliations, ideological biases.
Strategic interests.
Big time. All of that can color how they assess another state's regime type. These assessments can be debated within a government, they can be flat out wrong, or they can change surprisingly quickly depending on the political climate.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, a compelling one is the U.S. and Imperial Germany before World War I. Our sources point out that American opinion leaders actually stopped defining Germany as a democracy as the strategic relationship went downhill.
Even though Germany had some democratic elements, like an elected parliament.
Yeah, the Reichstag.
Yeah.
But as tensions rose, as strategic competition heated up, the narrative shifted. Germany increasingly got painted as autocratic, militaristic, a threat.
So the perception changed because the relationship changed.
It suggests perception can be an outcome of foreign relations, not just a cause of peace. You define your adversary as illiberal, perhaps, to justify opposing them.
Wow. That really flips the script, doesn't it? If you redefine who counts as a democracy based on whether you're friends or enemies?
It fundamentally challenges the idea that an objective assessment of democracy is reliably driving the peace.
So does that kill the normative logic or just make it way more conditional?
It definitely makes it far more conditional. And it highlights this tendency, maybe particularly for liberal states, to redefine who counts as trustworthy. based on other factors.
Like what?
Prestige, security worries, economic interests. Think about 19th century imperialism. Non-European peoples, often deemed incapable of self-governance, justifying colonial rule.
Or even more recently.
Even Japan in the late 20th century. Clearly a liberal democracy, but when economic tensions flared with the U.S., that shared democratic identity didn't always guarantee smooth relations or unquestioning trust.
So this subjective redefinition is a powerful counterargument to the idea of automatic trust and respect between democracies.
It really is. It complicates that need picture significantly. Before Anglo-American and Franco-American crises, illustrative cases.
Okay, to really bring this perception piece to life, let's look at some historical examples from our sources. These moments where the U.S. interacted with France and Britain at critical times. They're fascinating.
They really are. These aren't just historical footnotes. They're moments that show how these theories play out in the real world, often challenging simpler interpretations. They show how much perception matters.
So what are these cases?
Well, these four crises really highlight the complex interplay of liberal ideology, power, and especially those changing perceptions, sometimes leading to outcomes you wouldn't expect just based on power politics.
All right, let's hear them.
First, let's take one. Franco-American relations, 1796-98, the Quasi-War. This was basically an undeclared naval war. The U.S. was newly independent, France was revolutionary, and the French were seizing American ships.
Sounds like a conflict between two young republics, maybe.
You might think so. But the U.S. perception, especially among Jefferson's Republicans, who felt a strong kinship with the French Revolution, that was key.
They saw France as a sister republic?
Yes. Despite France being internally unstable, having coups, the Republicans largely forgave France, blamed Britain instead. They expected peace with this fellow republic.
And the result?
The result was that the moderate Federalists, who were in power but didn't share that same pro-French fervor, were constrained by public opinion. The public, influenced by liberal elites, still saw France as a sister republic, which prevented a full-scale war, even though France was hurting U.S. interests.
So that shared identity, even if idealized, acted as a brake on conflict.
A powerful brake.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that with two, Anglo-American relations, 1803-12, leading to the War of 1812. Again, Britain and France seizing U.S. ships, plus Britain was impressing American sailors. This time, the U.S. declared war on Britain.
Okay, critics often point to this as a war between two democracies, right? A challenge to the theory.
They do, but again, perception is key. The U.S. Republicans saw Britain not as a liberal democracy, but as a monarchy. An oppressive one.
Even though Britain had parliament and some representation.
Yeah, but pre-1832 Reform Act, Britain wasn't seen as truly liberal by American standards. Unelected House of Lords, uncompetitive elections in many places, cabinet responsible to the king. So the U.S. sided with Republican France, even under Napoleon's increasingly authoritarian rule.
Because they perceived Britain as illiberal.
Exactly. So the outcome makes more sense through that lens. The U.S. went to war with Britain because it perceived it as an illiberal monarchy, not a fellow democracy sharing its values. Perception dictated the willingness to fight.
Wow. So in both cases, the American view of the other country's regime type was absolutely central. The label mattered more than some objective checklist. That's really eye-opening.
Precisely. The subjective lens shaped the objective reality of peace or war. Okay, case number three. Anglo-American relations, 1861-63, during the American Civil War.
Right. Britain stayed neutral, mostly.
Mostly, despite huge pressure and crises like the Trent Affair, which nearly caused war. Realists might have predicted Britain would intervene, maybe to keep the U.S. divided and weaker.
But they didn't. Why not? Perception again.
Perception played a huge role, but it shifted. Initially, many British leaders and elites saw the Union negatively, maybe as mob rule, definitely illiberal because of slavery. Lincoln wasn't initially fighting an explicitly anti-slavery war.
But then came the Emancipation Proclamation.
Exactly, late 1862. That was a game changer for British public opinion. It signaled the Union was fighting for abolition, a cause deeply supported by British liberals and the public.
So public opinion tied the government's hands.
Significantly, the British cabinet, people like Prime Minister Palmerston, were constrained by this powerful pro-union sentiment. Palmerston even admitted privately that slavery was the big obstacle to mediating or intervening. So, changing perceptions of the Union's liberal character helped prevent war.
Fascinating. Okay, one more case.
Last one. 4. Anglo-American relations, 1895-96, the Venezuelan crisis. U.S. President Cleveland basically issued an ultimatum to Britain over a border dispute in Venezuela. Very tense, almost led to war.
But it didn't. What was different this time?
Well, by this point, U.S. perception of Britain had evolved again. After Britain's Third Reform Act in 1884 expanded voting rights significantly, many influential Americans started seeing Britain as genuinely democratic. People like Andrew Carnegie predicted a more peaceful Britain because of these reforms.
And the British view.
The British press showed general revulsion at fighting the U.S. They talked about shared Anglo-Saxon liberty. Key figures like Joseph Chamberlain worked hard against conflict, envisioning the U.S. and British flags floating together.
So mutual recognition as democracies helped diffuse the crisis.
It seems so, especially when you contrast it with British fury over Germany's Kruger telegram around the same time. Britain clearly trusted the democratic U.S. more than Imperial Germany.
So the big takeaway from all these cases, liberal perceptions can prevent war, even when power politics might suggest conflict is likely.
That seems to be the lesson. It's not just being a democracy, it's being seen as one. And that perception is fluid, powerful, and can genuinely shape whether states fight or cooperate. Perception can be as potent as military hardware. 3. The democratic peace under scrutiny. Challenges to the causal logics.
Wow, those historical cases definitely add layers of complexity. It's not a simple A causes B situation at all. So while perception is clearly huge, let's turn our critical eye back to the core mechanisms themselves.
Right, the normative and institutional logics.
Exactly. The idea that democracies are inherently more respectful, less likely to use force against each other, or that their institutions reliably prevent war. It sounds good, but how well does it actually hold up when you really scrutinize the historical record?
This is where the theory faces some of its most serious challenges and where our sources really push us to reconsider fundamental assumptions. The neat causal stories start to look a bit frayed.
Okay, let's start with the normative logic again. Do democracies really externalize specific norms consistently?
Well, the evidence suggests, maybe not as much as we'd like to think, a huge piece of counter-evidence comes from the long and often pretty brutal history of imperialism by liberal democracies.
You mean like Britain and France in the 19th century?
Precisely. From roughly 1815 to 1975, our sources show liberal democracies like Britain and France were involved in a staggering 66 out of 108 extra-systemic wars.
Extra-systemic, meaning wars outside the main state system.
Yeah, conflicts involving a state fighting non-state actors or entities outside the traditional interstate system, basically. Colonial and imperial wars.
66 out of 108, that's a lot.
It's more than half. And these weren't minor skirmishes. About half were imperial wars against previously independent peoples, often driven by profit, resources, spheres of influence. The other half were colonial wars fought specifically to maintain or impose autocratic rule over colonies.
But wasn't the argument sometimes that these were for self-defense? Or maybe spreading civilization?
That argument is strongly challenged by the data. Many were clearly preventive wars. Britain fighting in Afghanistan to preempt Russia, France and Tunisia to preempt Italy. Not direct self-defense.
And liberal alternatives were often ignored.
Often, yes. Things like offering military aid to local rulers or using diplomacy to deter rivals were available but not chosen. And critically, significant interventions were driven by competition between liberal states like Britain and France, who should have trusted each other according to the theory.
Right. And were these wars fought to spread democracy?
Generally, no. The goal was usually not promoting human rights or replacing autocracy with liberalism. Often they just replaced one illiberal local government with another or simply imposed direct colonial rule for the empire's benefit.
So this record really casts doubt on the idea that democracies reliably export peaceful norms or only fight for popular liberal purposes.
It seriously complicates it. It shows liberal democracies were perfectly willing to use force, often aggressively, against non-democracies, frequently for self-serving reasons. The Pacific norm didn't seem to apply there.
Okay, that's a major challenge from history. But what about more recently? The Cold War. Did the U.S., the leading liberal democracy, consistently show trust and respect towards other democratic states, especially when things got tense?
That's another area where the normative logic looks shaky. The record of U.S. interventions against democracies during the Cold War is, well, it's sobering.
Because the theory says democracies should trust and respect each other.
Exactly. But when U.S. national security, which, let's be honest, often meant containing communism, but was also frequently tied up with economic interests, like oil companies or fruit companies, when those perceived interests clashed with democratic principles in another country, the trust and respect often took a back seat, consistently.
Can you give some examples? The list is quite long, isn't it?
It is. Think about Iran in 1953. The U.S. helped overthrow Mossadegh, who was democratically elected, largely because he nationalized the oil industry.
Guatemala in 54.
Guatemala in 1954. The U.S. backed an invasion to oust Arbenz, whose land reforms threatened the United Fruit Company, again a democratically elected leader.
It continues, right? Indonesia, British Guyana.
Indonesia from 1957, helping rebels against Sukarno's guided democracy. British Guyana from 1961, subverting the leftist but elected, Jagan, even working with the British to change election laws.
Brazil, Chile.
Brazil in 61 and 64, assisting a coup against Goulart, Chile in 73, supporting the coup against the socialist but democratically elected Allende after he nationalized copper mines.
Even Nicaragua in the 80s?
Nicaragua from 84, trying to roll back the Sandinistas, who arguably came to power through a more democratic process than the U.S.-backed regime they replaced.
Now, some might argue these were often covert operations. Does that change the implication? Does it mean democratic constraints were working a bit, forcing it underground?
That's a fair question, but does it really negate the fundamental lack of trust and respect?
Probably not.
I'd argue it doesn't. It points to a different method of intervention, perhaps chosen to avoid domestic or international outcry. But the core act, undermining another democracy because its policies clashed with perceived U.S. interests, fundamentally contradicts the normative logic.
So the liberal norms just weren't strong enough when national security or key economic interests were seen to be at stake.
That seems to be the pattern. These cases suggest that democratic officials who were supposed to embody these norms showed remarkably little respect for fellow democracies when push came to shove. B, the institutional logic. Do domestic structures truly constrain war?
Okay, that's a pretty significant dent in the normative logic. The ideal of mutual trust and respect seems quite conditional. What about the other pillar, the institutional logic?
Right, the idea that democratic structures themselves, accountability, checks and balances, transparency, act as brakes on war.
Yeah. Are democratic leaders really more accountable to peace-loving publics? Do those checks and balances actually slow things down or ensure transparency like the theory predicts?
Here, too, the reality on the ground often looks different from the neat theoretical model. These institutional constraints often prove less robust than assumed, especially when leaders feel high stakes are involved.
Okay, let's break it down. What about leader accountability and public constraint? Are democratic leaders more afraid of losing power if they lose a war?
Surprisingly, there's not much consistent evidence for that. Some studies actually suggest autocrats have historically faced harsher consequences, losing office, prison, even execution for losing costly wars. Democratic leaders might just lose the next election.
And the idea of the public always wanting peace.
That's often a myth, or at least very context-dependent. Public opinion isn't, as one source says, an infallible specific against war. History is full of examples of publics being very bellicose indeed.
Right.
Think of British enthusiasm for the Crimean War, or how Boer War pacifists were vilified. And elites can whip up public support for war, right?
Sure, fanning the flames of nationalism.
Exactly. Wilson and WWI, FDR demonized in Japan before WWII. They successfully mobilized public opinion, even without an immediate existential threat. Plus, you have the rally around the flag effect.
Where everyone supports the leader in a crisis, even the opposition.
Right. Which means that opposition support isn't necessarily a reliable signal of constraint. So the public isn't always a pacifying force, and accountability might not be as strong a deterrent as theorized.
Okay, so public opinion and accountability are shaky constraints. What about the institutions themselves? Slow mobilization and circumventing checks and balances.
This is another area where the theory meets hard reality. The idea that democratic checks slow down war decisions is frequently undermined by practice. Leaders find ways around them.
How?
Look at the U.S. military action taken over 200 times. How many formal declarations of war by Congress, as the Constitution requires?
Very few. 5, I think the source said.
Exactly. Presidents have consistently found ways to bypass Congress. They claim national security overrides the Constitution, like Jefferson with the Barbary Pirates.
They redefined military actions to avoid calling them war.
Washington, Jackson did that, Wilson too. They placed troops in harm's way deliberately to provoke conflict, Polk, before the Mexican-American War. FDR with naval actions before WWII.
Or they just ignore Congress altogether.
Truman in Korea. Nixon bombing Cambodia. Bush in the first Gulf War. When leaders perceive a vital national interest, that democratic need for open debate often gets trumped by the perceived military needs for secrecy and speed.
So when push comes to shove, those institutional constraints can be bypassed surprisingly easily. The slow mobilization doesn't always happen.
It often doesn't. Which brings us to the third institutional claim: incapability of surprise attack and transparency.
It's the idea that democracies can't launch surprise attacks because everything's out in the open.
Yeah. But this is also challenged by the evidence. Democracies are capable of surprise attacks. Surprise often happens not because the defender lacked information, but because they couldn't interpret the signals correctly amidst all the noise, or due to cognitive biases.
And democracies have pulled off surprise attacks.
Absolutely. Think of the British-French-Israeli attack on Egypt in 1956 over Suez. Highly secretive planning.
Or Israel in the Six-Day War.
Israel's initiation of the Six-Day War in 1967 involved extensive secrecy and deception. Leaders will sacrifice openness for military advantage if they feel the stakes are high enough.
And does all that transparency actually help, or can it backfire?
That's the transparency paradox. Sometimes having too much information from an open system, conflicting signals from politicians, media, interest groups, can actually be confusing for an adversary. It might reinforce misperceptions rather than clarifying intentions.
So the core mechanisms of democratic peace, the norms, the accountability, the checks and balances, the transparent, they all seem much more fragile, more easily bypassed than the simple theory suggests.
They are definitely more complicated and conditional. The ideal often clashes with the pragmatic, sometimes harsh realities of international politics and perceived national interest. It certainly challenges the idea that democracy automatically causes peace through these specific internal workings. 4. Expanding the Kantian framework: democracy, interdependence, and international organizations.
Okay, so we've taken a pretty deep, critical look at those core democratic peace mechanisms and found them, well, maybe not as robust or reliable as initially advertised. The normative and institutional logics face some serious challenges. But Kant's original vision, as you mentioned, was broader than just democracy alone, wasn't it? He had those three pillars.
Exactly. Democracy, or republicanism as he called it, was just one part. He also emphasized economic ties, that commercial spirit, and international cooperation, the federation.
So what happens when we look at all three together? Does the picture change? Maybe the synergy between them is what matters.
This is where we get into the broader Kantian peace framework. And it offers a more comprehensive and arguably more empirically supported perspective.
Still acknowledging realism, though. Kant wasn't ignoring power politics.
Not at all. Remember, he accepted the reality of international anarchy, the role of balance of power. Very realist in that sense. But he believed you could build a more lasting peace on top of that reality through these three interacting elements.
So how do researchers test this broader framework?
Well, good studies typically incorporate those traditional realist variables: balance of power, alliances, distance, major power status as controls.
To provide a baseline.
Exactly. To see if the Kantian factors have an additional independent effect after accounting for realist explanations. The hypothesis is that all three Kantian elements, democracy, interdependence, IGOs, should reduce conflict, maybe especially among states linked by these ties, but possibly even system-wide.
So it's a more sophisticated picture, not just idealism versus realism, but seeing if liberal factors still matter within a realist world. B, empirical support for the three Kantian pillars, 1885-1992. Okay, with that framework in mind, let's look at the big picture evidence. Our sources analyzed data over a long period, right? 1885 to 1992. What did they find about these three pillars working together? Does this broader Kantian piece hold up?
Yes, the empirical evidence from these large-scale studies is actually quite strong. It suggests Kant was substantially onto something. When you consider democracy, economic interdependence, and international organizations together, they collectively and individually do reduce the likelihood of militarized interstate disputes.
Okay, let's take them one by one. What about democracy in this broader context?
The finding here is interesting and specific. It's the democracy level of the less democratic state, in a pair the weak link that seems most critical.
So raising the democratic floor in a relationship is key.
That's what the data suggests. If the less democratic state becomes more democratic, the pair becomes significantly less likely to fight. The substantive effect is quite large. A standard deviation increase in democracy for that weaker link can cut conflict likelihood by over a third.
Wow. And this isn't just a Cold War thing.
No, the studies found these specific benefits across the 20th century actually getting stronger after around 1900 as democratic institutions matured globally. And there's a systemic effect, too. More democracy overall in the world leads to fewer disputes everywhere.
Okay, democracy still matters, especially at the weak link. What about Pillar 2? Economic interdependence, trade.
Here, the results are even more striking. measured by bilateral trade relative to GDP, again focusing on the state less dependent.
Why the less dependent one?
The idea is that if even the state with less to lose from disrupting trade still sees it as important, the incentive for peace is very strong for both.
Makes sense. And the finding.
Crystal clear. Economically important trade creates powerful incentives for peace, significantly reducing conflict. The effect size here is often the largest of the three Kantian variables.
How large?
A standard deviation increase in that trade to GDP ratio can cut the conflict risk in half.
In half. That's huge. So war is bad for business is statistically very powerful.
Incredibly powerful. Like democracy, more trade overall in the system also correlates with less conflict globally. And while some theories suggested trade could cause conflict, these studies found consistent peace benefits, regardless of the relative size of the trading partners.
Okay, strong support for trade. What about the third pillar? International organizations, IGOs, joining the same clubs, basically.
Right, measured by joint memberships in IGOs. Here the finding is modest, but nevertheless significant Pacific benefits.
Modest, but significant.
Yeah, maybe not as dramatic as trade, but still clearly there. The effect is strongest for what the researchers call politically relevant dyads.
Meaning?
Pairs of states that are neighbors, or where at least one is a major power, basically, the pair is most likely to fight anyway.
And for those dangerous pairs, IGOs help.
Yes. For them, a standard deviation increase in joint IGO memberships reduces dispute probability by about 13%. Not huge, but meaningful where it counts most.
And systemically.
Systemically, states that are more involved in IGOs than average are about 18% less likely to get into fights. The thinking is IGOs help with communication, bargaining, building shared identity, maybe even supplementing deterrence.
So putting it all together, while the specific internal mechanisms of democratic peace face challenges, this broader Kantian trio, democracy, trade, IGOs, seems empirically quite robust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The combined effect seems genuinely strong and consistent over the long term. It suggests it's not just democracy, but democracy embedded in a web of economic ties and international cooperation that really fosters peace. It's a more holistic picture. See, the role of the hegemon, an alternative or complementary explanation.
That Kantian framework sounds really compelling, especially with that empirical backing. But there's always the counter-argument, isn't there? Some realists would say, forget Kant, it's all about the hegemon.
Right, the dominant power,
Right.
hegemonic stability theory.
Exactly. The idea that one super powerful state, like Britain in the 19th century or the U.S. after WWII, basically keeps the peace by enforcing rules and deterring conflict. Or power transition theory, where peace holds when the hegemon and rising powers are happy with the status quo.
These are influential theories.
So how does the role of the hegemon fit in? Does it undermine the Kantian findings or maybe complement them? Is the peace we see just an artifact of U.S. power, for example?
That's a critical question these studies also investigated. And the findings are, well, quite surprising, actually. They challenge some standard assumptions about hegemons. The data showed that when the hegemon Britain or the U.S. historically was objectively powerful, there were actually more militarized disputes across the system, not less.
Wait, more power for the hegemon meant more conflict? That seems completely counterintuitive to hegemonic stability theory.
It is very counterintuitive. It runs directly against the expectation that a strong hegemon pacifies the system.
So what else do they find about the hegemon?
They also looked at when the hegemon felt threatened, measured by things like higher military spending relative to its economy. When the hegemon felt threatened, the likelihood of disputes rose throughout the entire system. It affected everyone, allies, non-allies, suggesting a kind of contagion of insecurity.
So a stressed hegemon doesn't stabilize things, it actually destabilizes them, spreads insecurity.
That's what the data suggests. Rather than a pacifying effect, a powerful or threatened hegemon seemed linked to more conflict system-wide.
So what does this mean for the Kantian peace? If the hegemon doesn't explain the peace, does that strengthen the Kantian argument?
It does lend support to the idea that the Kantian factors are doing real work independently. While some critics argued the democratic peace was just a Cold War phenomenon, an artifact of U.S. hegemony, these findings suggest otherwise.
Because the Kantian effects hold across different periods, regardless of the hegemon status.
Exactly. The Kantian influences seem robust and operate more broadly than just specific hegemonic periods. While hegemony clearly matters in international relations, it doesn't seem to be the primary driver of the peace observed in these studies. The Kantian factors offer a potentially more fundamental, enduring explanation for patterns of peace. V. Beyond interstate conflict. the puzzle of anocracy and civil war.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on wars between states, but that's only part of the picture, right? What about conflicts within states? Civil wars are devastating, seem increasingly common.
Absolutely. A huge area of research.
And there's this other very influential finding related to regime type that suggests a particular kind of regime is especially prone to civil war, the anocracy.
That's right. The anocracy hypothesis has been widely cited, very influential in conflict studies.
So first off, what exactly is an anocracy?
Think of it as a semi-democracy. It's a regime that mixes democratic features with autocratic ones. It's partly open, but also somewhat repressive. Neither a full democracy nor a full dictatorship. Stuck in the middle.
Okay, a hybrid regime. And the hypothesis.
It posits this inverted U-shaped relationship. Civil war is most likely in these anocracies the messy middle of the democracy-autocracy spectrum.
More likely than in full democracies or full dictatorship.
Yes, the idea is that full democracies have peaceful channels for dissent, while full dictatorships can brutally suppress any opposition before it gets organized.
But anocracies are the dangerous sweet spot.
That's the proposed mechanism. They allow dissidents just enough political space to organize and mobilize.
But not enough real avenues for peaceful change.
Exactly. They restrict nonviolent action, making violence seem like the only effective option. Then the state often reacts violently, and things escalate into civil war. It's this unstable, combustible middle ground.
That sounds plausible. And it's been a widely accepted finding, you said. B, unpacking the polity index, the problem of definition.
Yeah, it has been widely cited, yeah. Formed the basis for a lot of follow-on work on civil war, regime transitions. And this is a huge, but a closer look at how these regimes are actually measured reveals a pretty critical methodological flaw.
Uh-oh. This sounds important. How are they measured?
Primarily using the polity dataset, specifically the polity score. It's the standard tool in political science.
Yeah.
Gives countries a score from -10, full autocracy, to +10, full democracy.
Based on different components.
Right. 5 components, measuring things like how leaders are chosen, how constrained they are, how people can participate in politics. High scores mean democratic, low scores autocratic, and the middle scores. Those are the anocracies. Okay, seems standard. What's the flaw? The flaw is deeply embedded in the definition of the components themselves. Our sources point out what is essentially a tautology.
A tautology, meaning it's circular.
Exactly. It turns out that 2 key components used to calculate the polity score are quite literally defined by the presence of political violence or civil war itself.
Wait, seriously. The measure of the regime type includes the outcome it's supposed to predict.
Precisely. Let's look at the components. First, competitiveness of political participation, periconato. A middle score here, labeled factional competition, explicitly describes competition as intense, hostile, and frequently violent. It even says extreme factionalism might manifest in rival governments and in civil war.
Wow. Okay. What's the other one?
Regulation of political participation, peric. A middle score here, like factional restricted, explicitly includes regimes where policies of genocide or politicide are routinely carried out.
This is incredible. So if the very definition used to code a country as anocratic includes terms like civil war, frequent violence, or even genocide,
then finding a correlation between anocracy and civil war isn't really a discovery, is it?
no. You're essentially correlating civil war with itself. It's baked into the definition. It's like measuring wetness by seeing if it's raining.
That's a perfect analogy. It's definitional contamination. The predictor variable, anocracy, is partly defined by the outcome variable, civil war. Any correlation you find is suspect because it might just be reflecting that overlap in definition.
Does trying to account for timing, like using last year's score to predict this year's war, fix it?
Not entirely. Because lower levels of violence or instability might already be influencing the anocracy coding before a conflict hits the official threshold for civil war. The contamination can be subtle.
So what happens when you account for this? When you remove those violence-infused components?
The consequence is profound. When researchers recalculated the polity index without those problematic components, that famous inverted U-shaped relationship between regime type and civil war, it largely disappears.
It disappears. So the finding was an artifact of the measurement.
It strongly suggests that the original finding was driven primarily by the political violence already captured in the coding, not by some independent effect of hybrid political institutions causing the war. we were likely correlating civil war with indicators of civil war.
This is a huge methodological finding. It basically pulls the rug out from under the widely accepted anocracy hypothesis, doesn't it? It means we might have misunderstood a key driver of civil war for decades. See illustrative cases. When political violence predates anocracy coding.
To really see how this works in practice, let's look at a few specific country cases our sources highlight. They show clearly how the anocracy label often followed the violence, rather than causing it.
Okay, let's see the examples.
Take one. Bolivia between 1944 and 1970. Using the full polity scale, Bolivia was coded as an anocracy for much of this time. It had a major civil war in 1952. Looks like a fit for the hypothesis.
Right.
But when you unpack the components, Bolivia's anocracy score before and during the war primarily came from those par comp and Perig scores reflecting factional competition, meaning violence. If you look at the other components, executive recruitment, constraints on power, Bolivia was actually a near-perfect dictatorship leading up to the 1952 war.
So the institutions weren't really hybrid. The score reflected the violence.
Exactly. The historical period before the war, the sexenio, was full of political violence, coups, revolts. That violence led to the Civil War, and it led to the anocracy coding. Later, in the mid to late 60s, Bolivia had more genuinely hybrid institutions by nonviolence measures, but didn't have a civil war then.
Yeah, okay, so the violence came first, then the label. What's another example?
2. Rwanda around its 1962 civil war. Again, Rwanda was coded as an anocracy, mainly because of those violence-related par comp and Perig scores. By measures of executive power, it was basically a dictatorship.
And the history.
Intense factional violence between Hutu and Tutsi groups escalated dramatically in the years before 1962 massacres, pogroms. This led directly to the Civil War.
So, again, violence caused the war and also caused the anocracy coding, not the other way around.
It seems so. The underlying formal institutions didn't really change to an anocratic form before the violence exploded. The violence just triggered the coding. One more.
Yes, please.
3. Sri Lanka, 1978-1987. This one looked like a textbook case initially. Sri Lanka was coded as a democracy until 1983, then its polity score dropped, recategorizing it as an anocracy. A major civil war officially started in 1987.
Looks like anocracy led to war.
Right. But again, digging deeper. The underlying political institutions, executive elections, legislative constraints, did not change in 1983. What did change?
Violence.
Exactly. 1983 saw the eruption of widespread anti-Tamil pogroms and massive factional political violence. That violence is what triggered the Perig score change and the shift to an anocracy coding. The Civil War in 87 was a continuation of that violence.
So violence caused the coding change in 83, and then the violence continued and escalated into full civil war by 87. The institutional structure wasn't the primary driver.
That's what the analysis suggests. The violence caused both the war and the label, making the apparent causal link spurious.
These cases really drive the point home. What we were measuring as anocracy was, in large part, the very violence it was supposed to predict. It's a circular argument fueled by the measurement tool itself. D, the implications for measuring political regimes. So what are the big takeaways here? What does this mean for how we study the connection between political systems and conflict, both internal and external? This feels like more than just an academic debate.
Oh, it has profound implications.
Yeah.
It really forces us to be much more careful and critical about the tools we use and the conclusions we draw. It's a major reminder about methodological rigor.
What are the key lessons?
First, we have to be cautious with aggregate indices. Tools like the polity score are convenient for big studies, sure, but they can hide crucial details and bake in biases.
Need to look under the hood.
Exactly. Researchers absolutely need to scrutinize the definitions of the components. You can't just take the final score at face value without understanding how it was built. Otherwise, you risk serious misinterpretations.
And the second big lesson.
Avoid tautology like the plague. It sounds basic, but it's critical. You must ensure your predictor variable, like regime type, isn't defined even partially by the outcome you're trying to explain, like civil war.
Because if it is, your finding isn't real.
It's predetermined. It lacks genuine explanatory power. It's just a definitional loop and echo.
So how should researchers proceed if they want to study regime type and conflict accurately?
Well, it suggests it's often better to focus on specific components of an index, the ones that aren't contaminated by violence definitions. Or perhaps construct new indices that carefully avoid this definitional overlap.
To isolate the effects of specific institutional features.
Precisely. So you can test clear hypotheses about, say, executive constraints or electoral competition without accidentally measuring the conflict itself.
This deep dive into the anocracy hypothesis is a powerful reminder, isn't it? that how we measure things profoundly shapes what we find. Our tools can sometimes lead us astray if we're not careful.
Absolutely. It shows that even widely accepted findings need constant critical reevaluation, especially regarding the definitions and measurements being used. It turns out, understanding the how of measurement is just as important as understanding the what of the results. Quite puzzle indeed. Outro.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground today. A real deep dive into the democratic peace idea. From Kant's hopeful, almost elegant vision centuries ago, to the really rigorous, sometimes challenging scrutiny of empirical data and definitions today, we've seen just how complex the relationship is between a state's internal system and how it behaves externally, or even how peaceful it is internally.
We really have. We saw that the broader Kantian peace, that combo of democracy, economic interdependence, and international organizations, seems to hold up pretty well as a force reducing interstate conflict over the long haul.
Yeah, that trio seems quite robust.
But the specific causal pathways within the democratic peace theory, things like automatic normative trust or reliable institutional constraints, those turn out to be far more complicated, much more conditional than the initial theory suggested.
Democracies don't always act nicely, even towards each other, when interests clash, and those internal checks and balances. Leaders can and do find ways around them.
Exactly. And then on the domestic side, that seemingly solid finding about anocracies being magnets for civil war, well, it kind of dissolved into a definitional puzzle.
Which is such a crucial reminder about measurement, right? How vital it is to be precise about what we're actually measuring when we try to understand the world.
Absolutely. Perception, both in how states view each other and how we define regime types, emerged as this really powerful, often shifting force, maybe even more powerful than objective reality sometimes.
So this whole deep dive really pushes us beyond simple correlations, doesn't it? It forces us to dig into the how and the why, the actual mechanisms.
It does. It reminds us that while democracy and liberalism often go hand in hand with peace, the relationship is super nuanced. It's shaped by perceptions, by power politics, even by subtle biases possibly creeping into our data. It's a call for more precise thinking, more careful measurement.
Definitely food for thought. So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. If democracies can, as we've seen, sometimes act illiberally towards others or rapidly bypass their own institutional constraints when they feel threatened, what does that really imply for international efforts to promote democracy as the main pathway to global peace?
Yeah, it's just spreading democratic institutions enough. Or do we need something deeper? A transformation, perhaps, in how states and their leaders actually perceive and interact with each other, beyond just the formal structures.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.